So prolactin estimation we had already discussed. One thing which I want to highlight here, which is interesting, is assay interferences in the prolactin assay. So there is something called a high dose hook effect, which is shown in the first panel. So basically, what you need to have a sandwich. So this is the capture antibody, and this is the detection antibody. So the prolactin should be bound to both these antibody. But if you've got too much prolactin, you can have a complete saturation of both the detection and antibody as well as the capture antibody, and therefore the sandwich cannot form. As you can see out here, the sandwich cannot form, and because of this, you can get a falsely low prolactin levels, which is called a false negative result. Then further, you can also have heterophilic antibody. Some people may have antibody to the antibody, and this antibody can actually lead to formation of a sandwich, and you may detect prolactin where actually there is no prolactin. So this is the something called heterophil antibody interference. And further, there is something else called macroprolactin. So prolactin occurs in several forms in the blood, and there are some molecules of prolactin which are very big. So these molecules can actually, form a sandwich with multiple antibodies, and then this causes a high prolactin value, whereas the actual prolactin, functional prolactin, is not very high. The most important of these is, of course, the high dose hook effect. So what happens with the hook effect, as I discussed, saturation of all the prolactin binding sites. It typically occurs when your prolactin level is very high, if it is 10,000 microgram per liter or more. And how do you find out whether the hook effect was there? You need to do dilution. You dilute the sample 1:100 and then do the test again, and then you will get a high value, and then you find out that it has got a high dose hook effect. So whenever you are dealing with a very large tumor in the pituitary area, and the prolactin level is not very high, you might think that it is stalk compression. But before saying that, you need to dilute the sample and check for the hook effect, because if it is a prolactinoma, the management changes completely. You will not do a surgery if it is a prolactinoma, you will do something else. So this is again why it is called hook effect, some people might ask. So this is what happens. This is a log signal and the log dose. When the sample concentration increases, initially the levels keep on increasing, but after you hit a peak, subsequently at higher levels, the value actually goes down, and therefore you might actually get a very low or a normal value, a very slightly high or almost a normal value of prolactin, despite the prolactin actually being very high. Normally, there is a good correlation between the prolactin concentration and the tumor size. The larger the tumor, the higher the prolactin values. So prolactinoma prevalence, there you can see prolactinomas in 10 out of 1 lakh men and 30 out of 1 lakh women. If the tumor is less than 1 centimeter in size, that is true for all the pituitary tumors, it is called a microadenoma. If it is more than 1 centimeter, it is called a macroadenoma. So microprolactinomas are prolactin producing tumors which are less than 1 centimeter in size. And these are much more common in females, 20 times more common in females. But if you talk about the large ones, those are not very common, but they are equally prevalent in males as well as females, that is 1:1. The clinical features of prolactinoma typically are the same as that of hyperprolactinemia. You will have primary, secondary amenorrhea, galactorrhea. Galactorrhea typically will occur in females. It will not occur in males, because prolactin can produce milk only if the breast has been stimulated and ready for secretion by estrogen, by the estrogen in the blood. So in the females, estrogen levels are there, the breasts are developed, so they can secrete the milky discharge. In males, that is not going to occur, but hyperprolactinemia can cause increased estrogen level also by inhibiting the secretion of testosterone, and therefore long-standing hyperprolactinemia can cause male galactorrhea also. But generally, you will not see that in a male. Male hypogonadism, often very difficult to diagnose because it's insidious onset, unlike females in which the amenorrhea becomes evident quite easily. And probably that is one reason why you see larger tumor in males, because it is not diagnosed at an early stage. That is one theory. Then visual problems because of the chiasmal compression. You can have headaches because the tumor is enlarging inside the cella. It's enclosed space, and then you may have a headache. And then hypopituitarism, because the tumor, if it compresses the entire pituitary, you might end up with hypopituitarism. I will skip these, are not useful for us. Differential diagnosis are very important. You must, I probably didn't talk about this earlier. After you've done prolactin level, you must be doubly sure that the patient has hyperprolactinemia before you order an MRI. A common mistake which is done is that you see the prolactin high and you straight away go do an MRI. Now the problem with that approach is this: 10% of the normal population, that is 10% of you and us, if we do an MRI of the pituitary, we are going to find a very small pituitary lesion. 10% of us. Okay. So 1 out of 10%, we're going to have a very small pituitary lesion. It is an adenoma or it is something else, but it has been there since birth and it will remain like that till we die. So now, if you got a high prolactin because of some drug and you do an MRI and you find something on the MRI, the two may not be linked. That adenoma was there from the beginning. This hyperprolactinemia is because of drug. So you may falsely make a diagnosis of drug of microprolactinoma. And then the patient will have to take treatment for a long period of time. The patient will remain upset that she's got a tumor inside her brain. And so the implications of that are basically very, very long lasting and very destructive for the patient. So you must be sure of the biochemical diagnosis before you order the MRI. If you think it is a drug-induced hyperprolactinemia, stop the drug, repeat the prolactin. If the prolactin is normal, don't do an MRI. On the other hand, if you stop the drug and still the prolactin is high, then you must do an MRI. The other error which occurs is that you give what often some people do, that they see a prolactin, it is high, they give cabergoline, prolactin becomes normal, and they are happy. So if you've got a non-functioning tumor which is compressing the chiasma, not the optic chiasm, the stalk, if it is compressing the stalk, then prolactin will go down with cabergoline in such case also. But that will not cure the disease because the tumor itself is a non-secreting tumor. You've got to remove that tumor. So both ways errors can occur. So most important, first get your biochemical diagnosis in line. Once you're sure it is hyperprolactinemia, you've ruled out all the other causes, only then do an MRI. And if you know no other causes there, then you must do an MRI. You cannot just treat with cabergoline and just be happy about it. The other differential is Rathke's left cyst. These are again congenital and some of them may be innocuous. Lymphocytic hypophysitis again is an important differential on the MRI because these patients do have hyperprolactinemia because of the inflammation of the stalk, and the pituitary looks enlarged. A lot of people misdiagnose the pituitary adenoma, but a good radiologist will tell you that this is not an adenoma and this could be lymphocytic hypophysitis, which subsides on its own and sometimes is treated with steroids, and which may or may not later on have hypopituitarism. It may become normal also. And meningiomas, cellular meningiomas can also occur. So with that, we can come to the treatment of prolactinomas. So the first line is dopamine agonist therapy. So and remember, even if the patient is having optic chiasmal compression and the vision is being affected, still you should not send the patient to surgery. The first line is still medical management with cabergoline, and cabergoline is the preferred dopaminergic agonist. So how does these dopaminergic agonists work? They act upon the D2 receptor, they reduce the cyclic AMP and IP3, and this results in accumulation of the prolactin immunoreactive granules inside. This is the early effect, and they also increase the lysosomal acid prolactin proteolytic activity. So because of these things, there is an immediate reduction in the prolactin secretion. But there is a long-term effect also. They reduce gene transcription, and prolactin messenger RNA and prolactin synthesis also reduced. And later on, they also have an effect upon the cells. They are toxic to the tumor cells. They cause a perivascular fibrosis and partial cell necrosis, because of which there is a reduction in the tumor cell volume, and they may actually be having a true antimitotic effect. So the treatment of choice is dopaminergic agonist therapy, which not only reduces prolactin levels, but also kills the prolactin secreting cells. So you start with a dose of 0.5 milligram per week. Generally, we give it 0.25 twice a week. Then you increase the dose every 1 to 2 months, depending on the prolactin response. The target is to suppress the prolactin, not to make it normal. You want to make it low. If it is less than 5, then you reduce the dose, but you should keep it in the normal range, close to 5. And you can go up to as high as 11 milligram per week, very rarely, which is required in very large tumors, but generally 1 to 2 milligram per week will do the trick for most of the patients. So now this slide is just to show the wonders which cabergoline can do in a prolactinoma. So on the left panel, you see this patient. He's got a huge pituitary macroprolactinoma, and it is invading into the not only into the paracellular area, it's even going into the temporal lobe. And this is the same patient after about a year or so of therapy. You cannot see even a trace of tumor out here. No surgery has been done. Only treatment given was cabergoline. So this is what you can achieve by giving cabergoline in most of the patients. So sometimes you may get a biochemical radiological dissociation. Prolactin levels may be decreasing and the tumor may be persisting. This can occur if the adenoma cells change to a non-secretory type, or you have a necrosis or a cystic transformation or a hemorrhage in the tumor. So the tumor size will not decrease, but the secretion will decrease. And sometimes you have a tumor which has disappeared, but prolactin has not gone down. And that can occur if there is an invasion into the surrounding structures, and there are small cells out there which you cannot see on the MRI. The other option apart from cabergoline is bromocriptine, which is can be used if you do not tolerate cabergoline, but generally side effects are less with cabergoline, and overall the efficacy is much more. As you can see in the table, in terms of normalizing prolactin, cabergoline is much more effective in terms of tumor shrinkage, also visual improvement also. So side effects of the dopamine agonists are nausea, vomiting because of the stimulation of the dopamine receptors in the chemoreceptor trigger zone. They can cause postural hypotension. They can cause psychiatric symptoms. If you know, mania is caused by dopamine excess. You can have cardiac valvulopathy because of the 5-hydroxytryptamine 2B receptor stimulation and also retroperitoneal fibrosis. So these are the adverse effects. Now, how common is this valvulopathy? Should you be worried about valvulopathy in a patient whom you've given cabergoline? Well, data shows that only 2 patients out of 1,800 patients developed cabergoline-induced valvulopathy. Still, an annual cardiovascular examination is recommended. Echo should be done if you're using a dose of 3 mg or higher per week, which generally does not occur for most patients, and if your age is more than 50 or you've got a murmur on an examination. Otherwise, you need not do a routine repeat echo. So you generally have to start with a smaller dose and then titrate up. If you give a very large dose, you might end up causing an apoplexy or a CSF leakage. Some people may develop what is called a resistance to dopamine agonist, and this occurs in large tumors. And these are the doses at which we call it a resistance: more than 2 milligram per week of cabergoline, or more than 15 milligram per week of bromocriptine, and higher doses may be required in such patients. Mechanism of resistance could be there; they can be reduced of expression of the receptor, etc. These we can skip. If you have resistance to dopamine therapy, you can go to a high dose therapy, which is defined as more than 3.5 milligram of cabergoline per week. You can go for a surgery in such cases, and you can also go for temozolomide, which is sort of a chemotherapy, and you can also go for radiotherapy. So surgery helps you control the tumor volume, of course, but complete removal is difficult because the tumor is close to the other vital structures. Biochemical cure post-surgery is very rare, but typically they do a transfemoral surgery when indicated. So you do it when there is resistance to dopamine, if the tumor is increasing in size despite dopamine therapy, or the patient is not tolerating dopamine, or you have a visual deterioration despite dopamine therapy. Now, this is what I was talking about, why you should go for initial medical management. So these are patients with giant pituitary prolactinomas that are more than 4 centimeters in size. So they had 2 groups, group A and B, both had visual involvement, and they decided to give surgery first in group A, and in group B they decided to give dopamine agonist first. So you can see, look at the bottommost row, visual improvement. It occurred in only 2 out of the 13 patients who underwent the surgery, and it occurred in 6 out of 12 patients who underwent medical management. So even in such huge tumors, medical management ended up with a much better response in visual improvement. So the reason for that has been probably that when you are handling such a big tumor close to the optic chiasm, during surgery you may inadvertently damage the nerve fibers coming from the optic chiasm, and therefore your outcome in terms of visual improvement may actually be much worse. Okay, so we can skip this. Temozolomide is again chemotherapy. We can skip that as well. Radiotherapy. So radiotherapy is one option which is sometimes employed not only for prolactinomas but also for all other pituitary tumors. This applies to all other pituitary tumors. So there are 2 types of radiotherapies. One is a stereotactic radiosurgery, which is also called a gamma knife. So this is what it looks like. Basically, what you do is you focus the radiation from multiple sources in such a way that it converges into a single focal point inside the skull. And so this is called a gamma knife because you have a precision. You can really pinpoint where you want the radiation to go, and the remainder of the brain tissue does not take up much radiation. So a gamma knife is preferred if you've got a small tumor inside the pituitary which you want to kill. Then there is something called external beam radiotherapy. External beam radiotherapy is something like this. You've got multiple sources. This is a source here, there is a source here, there is a source here, and you've got multiple beams coming from various areas, and those beams are hitting at the same spot, the same area, but the involved area is much larger. The advantage of this is that you can sort of customize the way the rays come according to the shape of the tumor, so that the tumor takes up most of the radiation. Now, when will you do EBRT, external beam, and when will you do SRS? So, if your tumor is small, that is less than 3 centimeter in size, and it is not very close to the optic chiasma, then you can go with the SRS, because it's a concentrated dose in a small area. It will kill the tumor, and it is away from the vital structure, so the other structure will not be damaged. But if your tumor is larger in size, then the SRS will not be able to affect the entire tumor. And if the tumor is close to the optic nerve, if you do SRS, you will deliver a very large amount of radiation in one shot, and that radiation can damage the optic nerve or the chiasma. So, large tumor close to the optic nerve, if you want to give radiotherapy, you do EBR. Biochemical response rates are not very good, but if you not run out of other options, then you might have to do this, and this applies to other pituitary tumors as well. Right. So let's go back to medical management. The question remains: how long will you give the medical management? So basically, what you do is you continue the drug, you suppress the prolactin to normal value, and then after every 6 months to 1 year, you repeat the MRI, generally at 1 year, to see whether the tumor has shrunken in size. Once the tumor has almost disappeared, you don't stop the cabergoline at that point of time, because still the tumor cells may still be alive. And one common protocol that we follow is that we give for another 2 years after the tumor has regressed completely. We continue the drug for another 2 years, and that ensures that whatever cells are left are also dead, and then subsequent recurrence uh, of the tumor become less likely. So this is what generally is done for a microprolactinoma. Macroprolactinomas sometimes may not regress completely, in which case lifelong therapy is required. And again, some cases they may regress. Again, in those cases, again, after they've completely disappeared on MRI, you continue the drug for another 2 years, and after that, you withhold the drug. And another point which probably I do not made slides upon is pregnancy along with dealing with pregnancy along with prolactinomas. So a typical scenario, for example, would be a patient who was having hyperprolactinemia, not able to conceive, then picked up on evaluation as a microprolactinoma. The moment they put on and these drugs, they have a reduction in prolactin levels, they begin to menstruate, they begin to ovulate, and they may end up becoming pregnant. So if they become pregnant, what we do is we stop the drug. That is, the reason for the same is that the chances of the tumor growing in pregnancy are actually very low. So what we do, we stop the drug, and we monitor the patient clinically. We look for headaches. We do a visual charting to see if they are having any increase in size. If there are any markers clinically that the tumor is increasing in size, then we do an MRI to see if the size is increased. But generally, that almost never occurs in a microprolactinoma. That is more true for a macroprolactinoma. And if you think that the tumor is increasing, then you might go ahead and do an MRI to see the size. And in such conditions, then you might introduce the drug. But generally, it is quite safe to get pregnant, and there are no major complications, and the drug is withdrawn for the pregnancy and the lactation period. And once the lactation is over, then you reintroduce the drug to complete the course. Measuring prolactin levels in pregnancy is a little dicey topic, because prolactin levels are high to begin with. There are, of course, some schools of thought which say that a very high prolactin in pregnancy with prolactinoma warrants therapy, but let's not go there. Most patients, we do not do a prolactin level at all. So with that, I think we have come to the conclusion of this session. It was an overview of pituitary and a more detailed discussion of prolactinomas. So in a subsequent class, we can look at the other remaining pituitary problems such as acromegaly and non-functioning pituitary tumors also. So I will stop here. If there are questions, they can be asked now.
Sir, in patients with hypopituitarism, adult patients specifically, do we replace growth hormone also?
Yes, so that is a good question. So what Abhishek is asking is that would you replace growth hormone in adult patient with hypopituitarism or not? So there is a lot of controversy regarding should growth hormone be replaced or it should not be replaced. So as you realize, in a growing child, growth hormone has got the major role in increasing the height of the patient. So if the patient is definitely prepubertal, has not attained his height, then you have to give growth hormone no matter what. Growth hormone has to be given. In adult patients, the role of growth hormone is a little controversial. So in normal adult people, growth hormone helps to maintain the muscle mass to some extent. It prevents obesity, or rather, I should say that growth hormone deficient patients tend to develop obesity. They have less lipolysis, so the fat accumulation occurs. And growth hormone also has it is an anti-insulin effect to prevent hypoglycemia. But these effects of growth hormone are not very prominent, not very critical, and therefore the benefits of giving growth hormone in an adult patient have not been very clearly shown in studies and in clinical practice. So generally, for most patients with hypopituitarism, growth hormone replacement is not recommended. There is a lot of controversy in who requires a growth hormone replacement. But in some patients who may be experiencing increase in obesity or loss of muscle mass, or who may be feeling overall unwell, in such conditions, the doctor may consider giving them growth hormone, a trial of growth hormone therapy to see if the symptoms improve. But as a general standard practice, most patients will not get growth hormone replacement, even though they may be having deficiency when they are adult patients.
Sir, in hypothyroid-induced pituitary lesions, the treatment is only replacing the thyroid hormones, or do we have to simultaneously do the other measures as well if it is causing visual symptoms?
Can you speak up? I could not get it clearly.
Sir, in hypothyroidism-induced pituitary lesions,
right,
the ones we discussed, the treatment involves only replacement of thyroid hormones, or do we have to simultaneously do the other modalities if it is hampering the vision?
Other modalities being what?
Being surgical removal of the.
So there are two components to what you are asking. Hypopituitarism, if it is occurring, you have to look at what is the cause of hypopituitarism. If it is because of some tumor, then of course that management of the tumor has to be done separately, and at the same time patient has to be given a replacement therapy. So there are two components. One is that addressing the cause of hypopituitarism, what is the cause, and the other is that addressing the effects of hypopituitarism. So effects of hypopituitarism are hormone deficiency, so accordingly you will have to replace the hormones depending upon what all are deficient. Every patient of hypopituitarism may not have all hormone deficiencies. Some may be having only TSH and ACTH deficiency. Another one may be having only gonadotropin deficiency. So depending upon what axes are involved in that particular patient, you will replace the respective hormones. And depending upon what is the cause of hypopituitarism, you will take additional steps to mitigate that cause. For example, if it is lymphocytic hypophysitis, then you might want to give him steroids to treat that condition. If it is tuberculosis, you will give ATT. If there is some tumor, you might want to do a surgery, so on and so forth.
No, sir. I'm asking that in hypothyroidism, there is increased TRH, which leads to hyperprolactinemia.
Okay. No. In such condition, only
so
treatment of
that case
is sufficient. You need not give cabergoline to that patient. You will give thyroxine, which will suppress both TRH and TSH levels, and the patient gradually will get a normal prolactin. You need not go into other modalities like giving cabergoline.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
So in case of a pituitary tumor which is having signs and symptoms of hyperprolactinemia, do we have to measure all the other hormones as well? Because it may actually be a growth hormone tumor which is just compressing the pituitary stalk.
Yes, that is completely true. Whenever we are dealing with a pituitary tumor, which is so there can be two scenarios. Scenario number one can be you saw the patient and you thought the patient will have the pituitary tumor, and in such case you will go ahead and test for all the hormones. The second scenario can be that the patient was incidentally found to be having a pituitary tumor, which again case you will have to test for other hormones as well. So clinically, you might be able to see the effects of acromegaly in such patient. Definitely, you will go for a respective testing. But if you if you don't see any clinical features, only some basic tests are done. For example, you will do only an IGF-1 level in a patient who has got an incidentally detected pituitary adenoma. You will not go for a growth hormone suppression test. But if you think the patient has got acromegaly, then you will even do a GS suppression test as well. So basically,
Okay, so and in such patients,
all the hormones
in
have
such patients,
sorry, yeah.
in such patients, do we also give cabergoline also if it's causing a prolactin growth hormone tumor causing excessive prolactin secretion, or we just give the treatment for growth hormone?
The primary treatment is directed towards controlling the tumor itself, because the effects of the tumor generally are much more than that of the stroke compression. Very rarely, if you think that the main effect of hyperprolactinemia will be galactorrhea and menstrual disturbances. If you think that the menstrual disturbances and galactorrhea are primarily just because of the stroke compression, then it may make sense to give cabergoline. But it could be that the tumor has destroyed the pituitary completely, and because of that you are getting a hypogonadism picture. And in such cases, giving cabergoline may not help much.
Okay, sir.
So that that sort of idea you will get from looking at the pituitary MRI. Basically, if you think that only the stalk is being compressed and the rest of the tumor is elsewhere, then you may ascribe those symptoms to the hyperprolactin. And such cases you may use, but generally it does not happen.
Okay, sir.
In the example that you had mentioned that a female comes to us in shock and with resistant shock and with diarrhea, and she's carrying a T4 which is very low and TSH is normal. So in that cases, we replace both steroids, we give hydrocort, we give thyroxine. And the dose which we give is, the first dose in the emergency that we give it is 1.6 microgram per kg only, or do we initially give a bolus higher dose? And is there a time gap between giving steroid and thyroxine in that case?
Actually, whenever you are replacing, when you see the patient, in such a patient, it is not really emergent for you to give thyroxine immediately. And you may not be having, you have thyroid report at that point of time, still it doesn't make a difference. What is going to make a difference is, of course, if I'm the replacement of the glucocorticoid and middlecorticoid, that is the deficient part. So that is the first point. Second point is that even if the patient is stable and has come to you in an OPD, you always start off with your steroid replacement first, and you because if you give thyroxine first, the increase in metabolism will occur, and that may precipitate the crisis. The requirement for steroid may increase suddenly, and that may actually precipitate an adrenal crisis. So what you do is you start off first with steroids. You give steroid for a couple of days, at least 2 to 3 days, and once the steroid levels have built up in the blood, then you introduce your thyroxine. So in the emergency, there is no hurry to give thyroxine, and you should always first give the steroid, and then subsequently at leisure you can add the thyroxine, and the dose will be 1.6 mg per kg.
And sir, in myxedema coma also, the initial dose of we've read that initially we should give a higher dose of thyroxine.
So myxedema coma is of course different. Myxedema coma, again, you have to give steroids also. In myxedema coma, you give a very high dose of thyroxine because the condition itself is being caused by the hypothyroidism. And the reason you give a high dose is that, if you recall, the total hormone actually is 99% or more than 99% is the total hormone, that is the bound hormone, and less than 1% is the free hormone. So that high dose is given mainly to saturate the binding sites on the thyroxine binding globulin. So the initial bolus dose saturates that, so that whatever remaining is given, that becomes a free hormone. So that is the reason why you give a high loading dose in case of myxedema coma. But outside of myxedema coma, you should not give any loading dose to any patient.
Sir, in the example that you had mentioned, that patient had come to us with refractory shock and cold extremities, which was not responding to fluids. And she had a report which said that T4 is very low and TSH. So in that, clinically, by judging by that, just that thyroid report and the clinical picture. So at that time, we should just be giving steroids, IV steroid, and after 2 to 3 days, start with the normal dose of thyroxine.
Yeah, definitely. That's not a problem at all. See, myxedema coma occurs after months and months of low thyroxine. Somebody has got a T4 which is almost close to zero. He will not develop myxedema coma in 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Myxedema coma occurs over several years or rather months and months of low thyroxine status. So, if in the patient, even the patient who is not in myxedema coma, you can delay it for 3-4 days. There is no problem at all.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, I think so. There are no more questions. So, okay, thank you for attending.